So the European leaders, they don't want any negotiations. They just say, keep on fighting, don't talk to Putin, don't
Yeah.
negotiate, don't give an inch. Do you think one of the reasons they're doing that is that they're afraid if the Ukrainians begin talking more and more to the Russians that there's a chance that the Russians will eventually be able to turn the Ukrainians on the Western backers, that they'll come to this realization that, hey, these aren't our true enemies. The true enemies are the ones that told us to do this, that said as long as it takes and caused us to lose 1 million people, promised us NATO membership, led us along the primrose path, as John Mearsheimer says. Right.
Mhm.
Do you think that's part of the reason, and maybe one of the reasons that the Western leaders are afraid of, like, just nobody talk to Putin, don't negotiate, because they've staked everything on this, and then they've
It-
gone in so deep.
yeah, I think certainly can be a part of it. One thing is, well, negotiations humanize the Russians. It's easy to, when it's sort of like when you're in a car and you're cursing somebody in the passing lane or whatever for whatever infraction. Yeah, it's because you don't have to meet the person face to face. But when you meet a person face to face, you realize, oh, these people are human. They're not crazy. They have their perspective, and that's it's clear that the Europeans and the Ukrainian regime have been trying to dehumanize the Russians. And I think negotiations is, that's one thing that it does. It's more than that. But one thing that it does is that it begins to humanize them again. You're admitting that they are human beings that can be, even if the negotiations don't go anywhere, just the fact that you agreed to sit down with them, it tells everybody that, oh, you actually know that these people, are rational human beings.
Right. Well, you said earlier that with this proposal, with this memorandum and a potential ceasefire, that the problem is that the West and Ukraine still want to fight. That just seems crazy to me. If you're getting pummeled by your opponent, why do you want to continue to fight? I mean, Russia still wants to fight. It's almost like Russia's acting like they're beating this guy, and they say, "Do you still want me to do this? Let's."
Mm-hmm.
We can stop, and then you say, no, give me more, and and just keeps on pummeling them. That's what it feels like.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, it's hard to understand. But I think part of what we're seeing is just the refusal on the part of the West, and by the extension Ukraine, to to give up on the unipolar moment. I mean, they got in the habit of thinking of Russia as just sort of as um, is no longer a real rival, but again, a gas station masquerading as a country. Just not a country to be taken seriously. We can issue ultimatums to that, and they just got to accept it. And there was a time, like back in the '90s and early 2000s, where that was virtually true. And it just seems like they can't give up on that. I think it wasn't too long ago that Donald Tusk of Poland actually just said it outright. We are the powerful ones, and Russia is weak. And so, and I think that they just can't wrap their minds around what has happened. In this war, that Russia is not that weak, easily abused country to the east, but is a great power, and you need to recognize that and act accordingly. But you just don't see any signs of that. There's no sobering up on the part. It's just like, what was it? Oh, an example. There was a Foreign Policy magazine article. Again, foreign policy is one of the big kind of heavyweight is foreign foreign policy publications in the United States, very closely associated with the establishment and the foreign policy establishment in the U.S. But the article's title and its contents were essentially Russia is losing the war. On the basis it's admitted that the Russians were advancing, but of course there's huge losses and the sort of stuff that we're always fed. So this isn't just a tabloid. Again, this is a major establishment publication. And I think it reflects the thinking of a lot of these people. It's just they can't let go of that thinking. And so it's just like, so they continue to act in the same way. They keep on doubling down. It's just that, okay, we haven't done enough. It has to be another sanctions package. We have to send them a new weapon system. Which one? It just seems they don't really have a practical answer, but it's an article of faith with them. And I think, again, this is in great contrast to the Soviet years, the Cold War years, where, yeah, the Soviet Union was the enemy, but it was an enemy to be feared and respected. And so, you negotiated with them honestly because you knew, you understood that you couldn't simply issue ultimatums. You couldn't nobody would think about doing that back in those days. But now it's just done all the time. It's just the way these people talk. It's just contemptuous. They're completely contemptuous of Russia. And so it's just like, if you don't do this, you're going to get spanked. It's just, again, like Russia is a wayward child and the West is a schoolmarm. This is the way they seem to think. I think they really do. And they just have trouble giving up on this. And I think maybe the only solution, it doesn't matter what Russia says, it seems like it never really penetrates their skulls. But Russia really just has to crush Ukraine in this war. I wish it wasn't that way, but I think that's what we're looking at. They have to actually be crushed, and in crushing Ukraine, with Western support, but the West maybe finally will understand that, okay, we can no longer be contemptuous of these people. We need to respect them, and we need to recognize their concerns and respond to them. We're just not there yet. You just don't even hardly see any signs of that. Outside of a couple of dissident governments, like Slovakia and Hungary, and some dissident political parties in the West. Well, the only place where you see, I guess, a sign of that is maybe in the mind of Donald Trump and a couple of his advisors. But it's just so very inconsistent. It's just sort of like he does seem to be waking up to this fact, but he's still mired in the old way of thinking. Right now he seems to be drifting towards closer to the Russians, but who knows? That's and that is again, that is infuriating the other Western leaders. They see this happening, but Trump's attitude, Trump will really be put to the test when a major Russian offensive is launched. And of course, we're expecting that to happen pretty soon. Again, it's like when the Russian army starts marching to the Dnieper, or maybe marching towards Kiev, or crosses the Dnieper and starts heading towards Nikolaev or something like that. There's going to be, just a tremendous amount of angst and anger and fear, on the Western side, and Trump is going to feel enormous pressures. I don't know if he's really prepared himself for that. I mean, it was going to be tough for him. Like we said, like one of the things that he fears most is an Afghan moment and being being humiliated by a loss. It would be pinned on him. I think if at this point it very easily could be, especially if he does slow down or cut off supplies of arms and intelligence. Now, again, he did that very briefly, for maybe just a few days, a couple of months ago, right? And I think we're coming to the end of the aid package. Basically, the arms that were allocated under Biden is supposed to run out, I think, within a month or two. And there will be a need for another, support package by the U.S. And, the question that's always in my mind is like, yeah, he doesn't want to pay it. His base doesn't. But if he doesn't, and then shortly thereafter, you just see a true collapse on the Ukrainian lines, everybody will start screaming and say that, this was because of Donald Trump. He lost this war. And that's going to be hard for him to deal with. He may, he may be drifting towards the Russian position now, but that might just cause him to, to return to the old yeah, basically neocon camp and prosecute the war just as before. So he's protected from those charges of causing the defeat of the Ukrainian army.